Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm here with our final video in our series on World War II where we will be looking at the Pacific theater of the war. Now in the days following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese army would also invade Thailand, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong. So just really looking to advance very quickly to establish their dominance in the Pacific. And then by mid-December, Japan would also attack the Philippines, and about 6 months later, in May of 1942, they had forced an Allied surrender. And what happened was prisoners of war taken in the Philippines were forced to walk 60 miles to a prison camp in the city of Bataan, and of the 76,000 who began the quote-unquote Bataan Death March, only 54,000 of them actually survived the trip. So there's a picture there of the Bataan Death March. This was just another example of something that just really angered and riled up all Americans, got them united against Japan, and was something that American forces would look to get revenge for in the future. They would want to return to the Philippines and get vengeance for what happened to the people who were on the Bataan Death March. So we're here at the map just to show you the height of Japanese control, all the areas in orange and then the orange line, just to show, we will come back to this quite often, the battles of the Japanese theater and how the American forces were able to advance toward Japan. Now, America's strategy in attacking Japan is called island hopping, where there were small key islands that would be captured and then used as bases to move to the next island. So they would capture an island and use it as the launching point to the next strategic island. And this was how America hoped to move through the Pacific. So in May of 1942, America would defeat Japan in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was important because this stopped Japan's advance toward Australia. All of you know Australia is an island continent in the Pacific, and the conquering of Australia was included in Japan's eventual plans in gaining superiority in the Pacific, but the Battle of Coral Sea put that to a stop. And then in June, America won the Battle of Midway, which is an island near Hawaii, and in this battle they would kill over 3,000 Japanese soldiers compared to losing 300 themselves, but they would also destroy 4 aircraft carriers and nearly 250 Japanese airplanes. Now, this was the first major victory for the United States, and in addition to the soldiers that they were able to kill, the destruction of machines and of military vehicles would actually end up being more important, and we'll talk about that more going forward. So there's a photo there of the Battle of Midway. You can see it's an air and sea battle and just a very heroic effort by those pilots, and one that would pay off incredibly well in the long run. So you can see here we've got labeled the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway, the first 2 important American victories in eventually conquering the Pacific. Now, one of the most vicious campaigns in the Pacific theater was on one of the Solomon Islands called Guadalcanal, and it was fought from August of 1942 to February of 1943. So this was a 6-month-long battle. And you can see there in the picture on Guadalcanal and in many of these Pacific islands, you know, there's a lot of dense jungle, very unfamiliar terrain to a lot of soldiers, and this was what really set it apart from the European battles because, again, the forestry is very dense, the soldiers are in very hot and muggy conditions, just entirely different from what the soldiers were experiencing in Europe. Now, over the 6 months of Guadalcanal, there were 3 major land battles, 7 naval battles, and almost daily aerial battles, and there were 7,000 Allied troops who were lost on Guadalcanal compared to over 19,000 Japanese troops. This was really the first big battle of the Pacific, and again, one that the United States was able to win. And Japan did make a final attempt in December of 1942 to strike that sort of death blow and recapture Guadalcanal, but it failed, and this would mark a major turning point for the Allies in the Pacific, which we will talk about moving forward. So you can see there Guadalcanal right next to the site of the Battle of the Coral Sea. And if you look at the map, you can see that now America has really eaten away at the outskirts of Japanese control, and now they could worry about progressing both west and north towards Japan. So after their victory at Guadalcanal, the Allies were able to shift to more offensive tactics because Japan began to struggle to keep up with both troop and mechanical losses. If you can remember from the last couple battles, Japanese losses were much, much higher than Americans. But even moreover, if you remember back towards the beginning of the war, Japan's major motivation for a lot of these invasions was to gain the materials that they were lacking, like oil, like gasoline, rubber, and others. And the destruction of these planes and ships, which required those materials to create, was much more difficult for Japan to make up for than it would have been for America, because Japan just simply didn't have the resources to replace planes or ships that were destroyed. Now, while there was a slight lull in fighting after Guadalcanal, America would use the time to spur its booming industry into creating more ships and planes, training even more troops to prepare for this big push towards Japan. And one of the more popular stories is that President Roosevelt had originally been criticized for saying that American industry would create 50,000 planes in 1 year, which was just unheard of at the time. But the resolve and the dedication of American workers would actually see them create over 100,000 planes in the space of a year. Just again reinforcing the dedication and the ability of American workers in fighting this war at home. Now, the goal that America had was to island hop close enough to Japan to begin bombing campaigns and not necessarily ever have to invade on land. So this was somewhat similar to Hitler's plan, if you remember back, for the Battle of Britain, to gain air superiority and then hopefully not have to launch a land invasion, but rather just gain victory via air strikes. So by June of 1944, America had taken Guam and other nearby islands, which would give them a base to begin bombing Japan. Again, another important step in their goal for eventual victory. And then in October, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, America would destroy much of Japan's remaining naval force. And again, going back to Japan lacking in important resources, because Japan didn't have the oil and gasoline that they needed, a lot of their remaining ships couldn't be used for the majority of the war anyway. And this, again, was just one more example of a detriment to Japan, a major disadvantage, and something that just helped keep momentum on America's side. Now, Leyte Gulf was also important because, obviously, if you think back, that was the site of the Bataan Death March. You know, the Philippines had been an American territory, and so when America was able to take back the Philippines, that was that revenge moment for what had happened earlier in the war. So you can see there on the map, we've got Guam and we've got Leyte Gulf. Again, American troops are just progressing through the Pacific towards Japan, and Guam would provide a base for bombing campaigns that would be very important going forward. Now, American forces would seize Iwo Jima in March of 1945, and then the island of Okinawa in June of that same year. And you can see that very famous picture of troops who were planting the American flag in Iwo Jima to show that they held the island, one of the most iconic photographs to come out of this time period. Now, the fighting on these two islands was fierce because it was clear that Japan was not going to win the war. They were becoming more and more desperate, and so for their soldiers, it was literally, you fight to the death, and that's your only option. There was no surrender, there was no turning back, and they were just becoming as vicious as possible. Because of this, Okinawa would become the theater's deadliest battle, with over 20,000 Americans killed, nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and then some 40 to 150,000 civilians. So just incredible mass carnage and destruction on these two islands. Now, during this time, bombing campaigns from Guam and other islands on Japan would further cripple the nation's economy. Again, just continuing to push and push, making the outlook look that much bleaker for Japan going forward. So you can see there the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, again, just progressing for the American troops, and now they are right there next to the island of Japan. Now, in 1939, Albert Einstein had written to President Roosevelt and warned him that the energy capabilities of splitting the atom might lead Germany to try and create an atomic bomb. Now, Roosevelt, wanting to create such a weapon first, would create the Manhattan Project, which was a top-secret operation. And on July 16th of 1945, scientists in New Mexico were able to successfully test an atomic bomb. And there's a picture from that test site. The bomb would leave a crater of radioactive glass 250 feet wide. The shock wave would be felt over 100 miles away, and the bomb's mushroom cloud would reach 7.5 miles into the air. So just to give you an example of just how much power the atomic bomb that they tested in New Mexico had behind it, the blue star there on the map is where Waterman is in Illinois. Any areas in that red circle would be ones that could feel the shock wave of an atomic bomb dropped in Waterman. So we're talking Milwaukee, Madison, Bloomington, very large area. But then anywhere in the blue circle would be a place that could hear the explosion. So then you can see we're talking about the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We've even got some areas in Canada, all the way down to Frankfort and Louisville in Kentucky. So just a huge, huge area showing the immense power behind the atomic bomb. So on July 26, 1945, after they had tested the bomb, President Harry Truman and other leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration to Japan. And what it did was it warned Japan that if it did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. But Japan would not surrender, and so President Truman made the decision to use the atomic bomb on Japan. So on August 6th of 1945, a plane called the Enola Gay would drop an atomic bomb called Little Boy on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And on impact, about 70% of the buildings in Hiroshima were just obliterated, as well as 70,000 people in the city. And then 3 days later, on August 9th, another bomb called the Fat Man was dropped on another city called Nagasaki, which would kill another 40,000 people. Now, there were thousands more injured in both bombings, and many would die later from radiation poisoning. So calculating the exact number of deaths that were caused by these two bombings is very difficult to do, but you can see it's just enormous. And there are pictures of both of the bombs there on the left, and then both of the mushroom clouds on the right. Just two moments of incredible force and incredible destruction. Now there on the map you can see where Nagasaki and Hiroshima are located in Japan, the two cities that would feel the wrath of the atomic bomb. Now, because of the two atomic bombings and the fact that the Soviet Union had now began to invade the Japanese-controlled territory of Manchuria, Japan was forced to surrender. And August 15th of 1945 would be known as VJ Day, which stood for Victory over Japan, finally bringing World War II to an end. Now, in the years after the war, Allies would put many Nazi and Japanese leaders on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The most famous of these trials were the Nuremberg trials, where there were 12 men sentenced to death and 7 more sent to prison. And at these trials, a lot of international crime laws were written that we still use today. Now, in World War II, there were over 40 million people who died, including over 300,000 Americans and 20 million Soviets. The survivors of the war would face trying to rebuild their lives in their countries, and most of them would hope that peace would remain for a long, long time. So that's all for our series on World War II. This has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.